And thank you very much for tuning in today. Appreciate you giving me your time. This is what I wanted to talk to you about to begin the episode. It seems like China is potentially facing even more headwind from the United States. That's because the Biden administration says if it needs to, it is ready to escalate its campaign against China to block its access from semiconductor technology, which, by the way, China has used to power its military. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that the U.S. would do, quote, whatever it takes to protect Americans, adding that the U.S. could not allow China to advance its military capabilities with sophisticated American technology. Now, according to Bloomberg, the White House is potentially considering new sanctions on several Chinese tech companies, including memory chip maker Changxin Memory Technologies. It's also pressuring allies to further curb chip technology to China. At the same time, it seems like China could be doing the same thing to Western tech companies, similar at least to a degree. This is because Western tech companies seems like are being squeezed out of the world's second largest economy by the local Chinese authorities and domestic competition. Sentiment for Western brands have soured as Beijing encourages nationalism. This coincides with domestic companies stepping up their products and offering comparable alternatives. For instance, data shows Tesla shipments slumped last month, while local EV makers like BYD reported a rise in sales. And as for smartphones, Huawei's Mate 60 Pro sales have climbed this year, while Apple's iPhone sales plummeted. Apple's net sales in China are down, but still generated more than $2 billion in the last 3 months. Beijing is expected to play a more active role in driving local growth this year, especially in the tech sector, because China is trying to push to reach a 5% annual growth target rate this year. Meanwhile, investors want Zara owner Inditex to make its full list of suppliers public so they can better access any supply chain risks. Here's the story.
Zara owner Inditex faces calls from investors to make public its full list of suppliers. That's so they can better assess risks over things like environmental impact and labour practices. Rivals like H&M and Primark already publish which factories they source from. But Inditex is a rarity among big clothing retailers in not doing so, even though regulators and investors want more transparency from such companies. Retailers are under pressure to prove there is no forced labour in their supply chains and that garment workers are paid decent wages. US lawmakers have homed in on Chinese fashion group Shein over supply chain risks ahead of plans for a US share listing. In the EU, disagreements have stalled proposed new rules. They would require all big companies to disclose whether supply chains harm the environment or use child labour. Proposed sanctions for not complying could include fines of 5% of revenue. Inditex annually publishes the number of suppliers it sources from in 12 core countries, but gives no information on individual factories. Reuters asked its shareholders, including leading asset managers, what they wanted to see from the company in terms of improved disclosure. A number asked for more transparency. Dutch asset manager MN was one to say it had asked the firm for such data, but been rebuffed. Inditex declined to comment on the demands. A spokesperson said the company has a deep commitment to maintaining high standards in its supply chain.
Emergency expenses are unpredictable, but planning for financial landmines is not. Multiple surveys have found that a portion of Americans would struggle to pay an unexpected bill of $400 or more. Because the average credit card rate right now is over 20%, financial experts recommend finding a new credit card with a 0% introductory rate if you need some emergency cash. But they warn that you need to pay the balance off before the introductory rate ends. Another option is to ask about a payment plan if you need some extra cash. For example, medical providers often let people spread the cost of payments over several months. To prepare for the next big unexpected cost, experts also recommend saving small amounts consistently over time and putting that money into a high-yield savings account. And the S&P 500 NASDAQ ended down slightly on Monday as investors prepared for this week's consumer price data for February. And this is a month after January's numbers surprised to the upside. Here's a quick recap of markets.
U.S. stocks ended mostly lower on Monday, a day ahead of the latest inflation data, which could provide more clues on when the Federal Reserve might start cutting rates. The Dow rose 0.1%, the S&P 500 fell 0.1%, and the Nasdaq lost 0.4%. Investors are eagerly awaiting Tuesday's Consumer Price Index for February, especially since January's report showed that inflation creeped up a bit more than expected. While the overall price trend continues to decline, Ross Mayfield, investment strategy analyst at Baird Private Wealth Management, says Tuesday's report could once again show how tough it may be to reach the Fed's annual target goal of 2%.
Inflation has proven sticky. It has driven the Fed to take some of the rate cuts off the table that the market was expecting. And we could expect, an upside surprise tomorrow again. Some of that services inflation has been really sticky. Energy prices have rallied a little bit here, so the headline number could see some upside surprise.
In company news, Boeing shares dropped 3%. U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said on Monday he expects the plane maker to cooperate in investigations by the Justice Department and the National Transportation Safety Board into the Alaska Airlines MAX 9 emergency in January when a door panel fell off the jet mid-flight. Chip stocks extended recent declines, with Broadcom dropping over 1%, Nvidia shedding 2%, and Advanced Micro Devices falling more than 4%. And shares of Equitrans Midstream edged up 1.5% after EQT Corp said on Monday it had decided to buy back its former unit in an all-stock deal. EQT shares slid nearly 8%.
And speaking of inflation, it rose again in February. The Consumer Price Index increased 0.4% for the month and 3.2% from a year ago. The Labor Department's Bureau of Labor Statistics reported this just moments ago. The monthly gain was in line with expectations, but the annual rate was slightly ahead of the 3.1% forecast from the Dow Jones Consensus. Now, excluding volatile food and energy prices, core CPI increased 0.4% as well on the month and was up 3.8% on the year. Now, both were 0.1 of a percent point higher than forecast. A 2.3% increase in energy costs helped boost the headline inflation number, and food costs were flat on the month while shelter rose another 0.4%. U.S. defense plans will have to be scaled back as the Biden administration's 2025 budget defense request has been capped. A budget deal limits the funding increase to just 1% from last year. The request will be for $895 billion. From that, the Pentagon's expected share dropped about $30 billion. That means it can't buy stealth fighter jets or order aircraft carriers and submarines. The reduced funding will also delay efforts to replenish weapon stocks depleted by wars in Ukraine and Israel. Congress still hasn't even passed the 2024 budget for national security. The U.S. government is working under a continued resolution that caps spending at 2023 levels until the 2024 budget is passed. And the U.S. faces the toughest housing market in a generation or more, and it's not much better for renters. The president is seeking re-election, and he's making a pitch to potential voters. Here's the report.
I know the cost of housing is so important to you.
And President Joe Biden says he has a plan to bring it down. He's using his State of the Union address to urge Congress to pass a mortgage relief tax credit. It's for what he calls middle-class families. The credit would provide up to $10,000 for first-time buyers and some people selling starter homes. First-generation buyers could get $25,000 toward a down payment.
It's one of the ways that you really address the wealth gap in this country.
Critics are asking how Biden would pay for the credits. Some argue they could backfire by spurring demand and increasing home prices. But Biden's asking Congress to pass another measure to boost supply. It's to renovate or build more than 2 million affordable homes.
To make childcare affordable, to make housing affordable. I actually would call those two of our most important pieces of unfinished business.
For renters, Biden says federal agencies are cracking down on corporate landlords. He says they're watching out for antitrust law violations aimed at inflating prices.
People cannot keep up with the cost of rents. They certainly don't have down payments. We don't have enough Section 8, and so we have this housing crisis.
And more potential bad news. Gas prices have reached a 4-month high, according to AAA. The price hike threatens to unwind inflation progress and could frighten the Federal Reserve. The national average climbed to $3.40 last week. This comes after dropping all the way to $3.07 in mid-January. Experts say the increase is actually normal for this time of year. Fuel demand increases with warmer weather, and we're switching to the more expensive summer blend right now. So while the rise in prices puts more financial pressure on Americans, experts don't really expect the jump to affect the Fed's tentative plan to start cutting rates. And U.S. intelligence agencies said yesterday the country faces an increasingly fragile world order. And this is strained by great power competition, transnational challenges, and regional conflicts. And this was in a report released as agency leaders testified in Congress. Here's more.
Today, the United States faces an increasingly complex and interconnected threat.
The top U.S. intelligence officials delivered their annual global threat assessment on Monday, telling a Senate panel that the country faces an increasingly fragile world order. Their report largely focused on threats from China and a confrontational Russia, and the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, urged the senators to approve more military assistance for Ukraine.
The assistance that is contemplated in the supplemental is absolutely critical to Ukraine's defense right now.
CIA Director William Burns also urged continuing support for Ukraine, telling the Senate Intelligence Committee that it would help send a message to China about aggression toward its neighbors.
We're seen to be walking away from support for Ukraine. Not only is that going to feed doubts amongst our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to stoke the ambitions of the Chinese leadership in contingencies ranging from Taiwan to the South China Sea. The Ukrainians are not running out of courage and tenacity. They're running out of ammunition, and we're running out of time to help them.
The agency leaders also noted the risks of broader conflict related to Israel's campaign against Hamas in Gaza, after a protester interrupted the hearing with shouts about the need to protect civilians in Gaza.
Children are being starved to death.
Burns was asked about children in the Palestinian enclave.
The reality is that there are children who are starving in Gaza.
But is Israel doing that?
They're starving, they're malnourished as a result of the fact that humanitarian assistance can't get to them. It's very difficult to distribute humanitarian assistance effectively unless you have a ceasefire.
FBI Director Christopher Wray expressed concern about rising threats from Americans inspired by Islamist groups and other foreign militants since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel.
That threat has gone to a whole nother level. And so this is a time, I think, for much greater vigilance than has maybe been called upon of us before October 7th.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden sketched his policy vision for a potential second four-year term on Monday, unveiling a $7.3 trillion election year budget aimed at convincing skeptical Americans that he can run the economy better than former President Donald Trump. Here are the details.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday unveiled a $7.3 trillion election year budget aimed at convincing skeptical Americans he can run the economy better than his Republican rival Donald Trump. To help cut the deficit and pay for new programs, Biden wants to raise taxes by trillions on corporations and high earners.
You know, I may not get it done, but if you give me a Congress, I will. No, I'm serious.
Biden's budget for the 2025 fiscal year, which starts this October, includes raising the corporate income tax rate to 28%, forcing those with wealth of $100 million to pay at least 25% of their income in taxes, and letting the government negotiate to bring more drug costs down.
Look, this year Medicare is negotiating lower prices. for some of the costliest drugs on the market that treat everything from heart disease to arthritis. That's in the law that we've already passed. Now it's time to go further and give Medicare the power to negotiate lower prices for even more drugs over the next decade.
The budget, released days after Biden's fiery State of the Union speech, was quickly rejected by the Republican House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson, saying it reflected an insatiable appetite for reckless spending and a disregard for fiscal responsibility. Biden's campaign has struggled to shake voters' concerns about high prices and the U.S. economy's direction. According to a January Reuters Ipsos poll, 40% of Americans think Trump would handle the economy best, compared with 31% who picked Biden and 28% who either didn't know or refused to answer. White House budgets are always something of a presidential wish list, but that is even more so in the current political climate. U.S. agencies are currently operating without a full year 2024 budget, after hardline Republicans rejected an agreed-upon spending level.
Reddit yesterday disclosed that it plans to raise up to $748 million in its initial public offering, at up to a $6.4 billion valuation. Now, despite its cult-like status among followers, Reddit has lagged the success of contemporaries like Meta and Facebook and Twitter, now known as X. The company has never turned much of a profit. NTD's Sean Marshall has more.
Reddit is aiming for a valuation of up to $6.4 billion in its U.S. initial public offering, or IPO, the social media platform said on Monday, as it nears one of the most anticipated stock market debuts of the last few years. Despite the business being unprofitable, the company, along with some of its existing investors, is targeting a sale of about 22 million shares, priced between $31 and $34 each, to raise up to $748 million. The company's influential communities are best known for the meme stock saga of 2021, when several retail investors collaborated on Reddit's Wall Street Bets forum to buy shares of highly shorted companies, such as video game retailer GameStop. But the IPO could be volatile, given that Reddit will allow its community members to sell their shares immediately, instead of being subject to the usual lockup agreements that typically prevent investors from selling shares for 6 months after the IPO. So now Reddit is set up to become a meme stock. This is a unique IPO, and what happens with it is going to be partly driven by the buzz on the platform, said Reena Agarwal, director of the Georgetown University Center for Financial Markets and Policy. She also said regulators and policymakers are quite concerned about these issues. Sean Marshall, NTD News.
The Federal Aviation Administration's audit of Boeing's 737 MAX production process failed 33 of 89 tests. This is according to the New York Times. Here's more.
Boeing's 737 MAX production process has dozens of issues with quality control. That's according to the New York Times, reporting on Monday on an audit from the Federal Aviation Administration. The checks came after a door panel blew off an Alaska Airlines plane mid-flight in January. The paper said the aerospace giant failed 33 out of 89 product tests for the MAX, including checks on the component that blew off the jet, known as a door plug. Meanwhile, the report said supplier Spirit Aerosystems, which makes the fuselage for the MAX, passed just 6 out of 13 audits. It failed checks, including one that involved a cargo door and another on the installation of cockpit windows. Concerns were also raised about technicians who carried out the door plug work. The report said there was a failure to determine the knowledge necessary for the operation of its processes. The FAA, Boeing, and Spirit Aerosystems did not reply to Reuters' request for comment. Now the audit comes as Boeing scrambles to explain and strengthen safety procedures after the FAA temporarily grounded MAX 9 jets due to the January incident. That same event is subject to investigations by the Justice Department and National Transportation Safety Board. Earlier on Monday, U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said he expects Boeing to comply with the federal probes.
And Nvidia, whose chips power artificial intelligence, has been sued by 3 authors who say it used their copyright books without permission to train its Nemo AI platform. Here's the report.
AI chip champion Nvidia is being sued by 3 authors who claim it used their works without permission to train its systems. Brian Keane, Abdi Nazemian and Stuart Onan filed a proposed class action suit on Friday in San Francisco. They are seeking unspecified damages for people in the US whose content helped train Nvidia's NeMo AI platform. The trio say their writing was part of a dataset of almost 200,000 works used by the company before being taken down last October. Nvidia declined to comment on the case over the weekend, but the lawsuit drags it into a growing body of litigation by writers over generative AI. The technology creates new content based on inputs such as text, images, or sounds. Other firms facing similar suits include ChatGPT maker OpenAI and its backer Microsoft. Nvidia has soared in prominence over the past year on bets its chips will dominate the market for such AI products. Its shares are up almost 600% since the end of 2022.
And Bitcoin hit a new record high on Monday above $70,000 as the surge in the biggest cryptocurrency showed no signs of slowing down. Take a look.
Bitcoin keeps powering to record highs. On Monday, it surged past the $70,000 mark for the first time. By mid-morning in Europe, it was up around 4.8%. The world's biggest cryptocurrency has surged in value since the US approved exchange-traded funds that feature it. That has helped draw in a new class of buyers. Analysts say the prospect of US rate cuts has also helped, with investors rediscovering an appetite for riskier and more volatile assets. Fans of the token argue the gains are just getting started. eToro global market strategist Ben Laidler says new developments could support a further rise.
On that long list of crypto catalysts which are sort of out there in the wings, one of the big ones further out is that central banks start buying Bitcoin and hold it as part of their foreign currency reserves, very much as they do with gold today.
Some companies have also been adding crypto to their coffers, supporting the gains. But critics say Bitcoin remains far too volatile and of limited use for anything other than speculation.
And that's all for today's episode of NTD Business. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.